The damp, clinging scent of something ancient and ill-defined had begun to seep into Ezra Halloway as bones, a pervasive chill that no amount of radiator heat could dispel from the decaying brownstone, posted by Ezra Halloway. On the Unseen Archive Forum, category, Esoteric Investigations, thread, whispers from the wet place it started subtly. As these things always do, a faint discord in the familiar symphony of urban decay that comprised my days. My flat, perched precariously on the 5th floor of a building whose facade suggested a century of forgotten sorrows, was my sanctuary, or so I had always believed. But in recent weeks, its walls, once a comforting embrace, had begun to press inward, their plaster skins whispering secrets I dared not articulate, even to myself. It wasn't a structural shift, not a settling of old timbers. It was a deeper, more insidious alteration, a fundamental change in the very fabric of its being, as if the house itself had fallen ill with a nameless malady. My first inkling beyond the generalized unease came with the water. Not a leak, not a burst pipe, but a persistent, almost deliberate dampness that stained the corners of the ceiling, a blossoming darkness that seemed to possess a life of its own. It spread with a slow, deliberate cadence, like an invasive organism, ignoring gravity, defying logic. I tried scrubbing it, painting over it, even chipping away at the plaster, in a desperate attempt to find the source. There was never any source. The pipes were sound, the roof recently repaired. Yet the stains persisted, a map of some unseen fluid geography. Then there was the sound, a faint rhythmic fruit quack. Not of a duck, but something else entirely, something that seemed to echo from within the very walls, a sound both muffled and disturbingly close. It was a sound that seemed to mock the logical mind, a sound entirely out of place, yet stubbornly present in the deepening hush of the evenings. My cat Salem, a sleek obsidian creature with eyes like polished emeralds, had been the first to truly register it. His ears would swivel, twitching with an almost frantic energy, his gaze fixed on empty stretches of wall, a low, guttural rumble vibrating in his chest. He would stalk the periphery of the damp patches, his tail a languid question mark, his pupils dilated into bottomless pools of apprehension. He was no longer the aloof, self-possessed hunter. He was a sentinel, constantly vigilant against an invisible threat. The calendar on my kitchen wall, a gift from my sister, marked the date as the 36th day since the first damp patch appeared. Or perhaps it was the 36th day since I had truly noticed it, truly allowed its peculiar nature to pierce the veil of my comfortable denial. Denial, I've learned, is a formidable, if ultimately flimsy, shield against the encroaching strangeness of the world. I had always prided myself on my keen observational skills, a trait honed by years of academic pursuits in obscure historical texts and forgotten lore. But this defied the neat categorizations of history. It was a living, breathing enigma, one that seemed to grow more vibrant, more insistent with each passing hour. The dampness had begun to exude a faint, almost imperceptible odor sipping a metallic tang like old pennies left in stagnant water, mixed with something else, something fetid and undeniably organic, a smell that clung to the air and the very threads of my clothing. My landlord, a man whose sole concern seemed to be the timely remittance of rent, dismissed my concerns with a wave of his hand and a perfunctory suggestion of old building quirks. He was, predictably, not compliant with my pleas for a thorough investigation, his eyes glazing over with an almost willful ignorance. But Salem knew. He would rub against my legs, his purr a low thrum of anxiety, then lead me to the most recent bloom of moisture, his tail whipping slowly, his head cocked, as if urging me to see what he already perceived. The air itself had begun to feel heavier, almost viscous, as if it resisted my every breath. The dream started shortly after. Not the ordinary chaotic wanderings of the subconscious, but vivid, almost corporeal experiences that bled into my waking hours. Dreams of vast, subterranean oceans, of unseen currents pulling at the edges of my sanity, of structures of impossible geometry submerged beneath leagues of churning, lightless water. In these dreams I was always falling into a crushing blackness, yet strangely buoyant, a mere speck in an oceanic void. And always the sound was there. That peculiar mocking fork, distorted and amplified, echoing from unimaginable depths. I began to lose track of time, the days blurring into a continuous oppressive twilight. The electric lights in my flat, once bright and reassuring, now seemed sickly, casting long, wavering shadows that danced with an unsettling vitality. I found myself scrutinizing the patterns in the damp, convinced I could discern forms within them, grotesque, embryonic shapes that shifted and reformed as I watched. A profound dread, cold and absolute, began to settle in my chest, a dread far deeper than any fear of the supernatural. It was the dread of the unknown becoming known, of a hidden reality slowly, inexorably revealing its monstrous face, its ancient and indifferent gaze fixed upon my small, fragile existence. My apartment, once a refuge, had become a membrane, a thin skin separating me from something vast and terrible, something that was now reaching through. The silence in the flat, once a balm, had become a membrane, thin and taut, vibrating with an unspoken expectation. Posted by Ezra H. On the Unseen Archive Forum, category, Esoteric Investigations, thread, Whispers from the Wet Place. The peculiar dampness had begun to coalesce, no longer mere stains but actual deposits, glistening and semi-translucent. On the ceiling and along the upper reaches of the walls, it possessed an unnerving viscosity, a sheen like oil on water, yet it was not oil, nor was it ordinary moisture. My attempts to touch it, to scrape a sample, met with a strange resistance. My fingers would sink slightly, as if into a very dense jelly, then retract, leaving no residue, no tangible proof of its unsettling texture. It was as if the substance recoiled from direct contact, a living thing aware of my inquisitive gaze. The odor, that blend of brine and something undeniably putrescent, had intensified. Now a constant companion, clinging to the fabric of my curtains, impregnating the very wood of my antique desk. I found myself breathing shallowly constantly, as if to minimize the ingress of this noxious atmosphere into my lungs, though I suspected its reach was far deeper than mere respiration. Salem, my sleek black companion, had grown noticeably leaner. His emerald eyes now held a perpetual wide-eyed alarm. He would pace the perimeter of the living room, a restless shadow, occasionally letting out a low, drawn-out cry, a sound I had never heard from him before, a plaintive, almost desperate wail. The wailing of Salem, a sound both raw and deeply unnatural for a feline, seemed to tear at the very fabric of the apartment, unmasking the silence not as an absence but as a deliberate, heavy presence, a thing with substance and intent, posted by Ezra. On the Unseen Archive Forum, category, Esoteric Investigations, thread, Whispers from the Wet Place. The viscous deposits, which had previously clung to the upper walls, now began to descend, not dripping in conventional rivulets, but oozing, almost flowing with a deliberate sluggishness along the vertical surfaces. They retained their unsettling sheen, but within their depths I began to perceive subtle shifts, internal currents that hinted at a complex, non-homogeneous composition. It was as if I was watching a slow-motion geological process, alien sediments depositing themselves within the confines of my once familiar rooms. The metallic tang in the air had sharpened, growing more astringent, now mingled with a faint, cloying sweetness that was profoundly unsettling, reminiscent of overripe fruit left to moulder in a forgotten cellar, yet infinitely more sinister. It seemed to cling to the back of my throat, a persistent, unpleasant coating that no amount of water could dislodge. Salem, his cries having subsided into a continuous low growl, would trace the descent of these creeping stains with an almost hypnotic intensity, his pupils now fully dilated, reflecting the sickly diffuse light from the street lamps outside as twin points of frantic, unblinking awareness. He would paw at the edges of the encroaching moisture, his claws making no impression, his actions a desperate, futile protest against an invading tide. My sleep had fractured into fragments, each piece a shard of the same recurring nightmare, an endless dark ocean, but an ocean whose waves were not water, but something else entirely, a living, undulating mass of incomprehensible density, its surface rippling with internal light that was not light, but a deeper, more fundamental vibration. I was always suspended above it, just out of reach, yet undeniably a part of its vast, indifferent consciousness. The quack had evolved too. It was no longer a distinct sound, but a reverberating pulse, a deep, resonant throb that seemed to originate from beneath the floorboards, through the very foundations of the building, a percussive rhythm to the spreading damp. It was a sound that resonated not in my ears, but in my bones, a slow, insistent pressure that threatened to dislodge the very marrow. I found myself obsessively tracing the patterns of the descending substance with my gaze, my mind desperate to impose order, to find a recognizable form in the shifting alien geometry. But there was none, only an organic, self-organizing chaos that defied all terrestrial understanding of structure or growth. My internal monologue, once a fortress of logical thought, had become a battleground, besieged by an insidious, creeping irrationality, questioning the very nature of perception. One evening, as the last vestiges of daylight surrendered to the oppressive urban gloom, I observed something new. something that caused a profound tremor to run through the core of my being. On the surface of one of the larger, now almost topographical, formations of the viscous substance, there appeared a faint, almost imperceptible pulsation. It was not a reflection, not an illusion of the failing light, but an intrinsic motion, a slow rhythmic expansion and contraction, as if the substance itself was breathing. And with each subtle flex, a faint, almost crystalline sound, like grains of sand sifting through bone, emanated from it, a sound so delicate, yet so utterly out of place, that it scraped at the frayed edges of my sanity. Salem, who had been huddled beneath my desk, his body a tight, trembling knot of fur, let out a piercing shriek, a sound of absolute terror, and launched himself at the wall, scrabbling frantically, as if attempting to tear away the very plaster, to escape the horror manifesting upon its surface. He clawed with a desperate, unhinged ferocity, leaving shallow gouges in the old paint before recoiling hissing, his fur bristling like a static charge, his eyes fixated on the pulsating mass with a horror I mirrored. The pulsating spread, propagating across the entire visible surface of the dampness, turning the formerly inert, glistening film into a living, subtly shifting tapestry. The odor intensified further, now with a new, sharper component, something acrid and metallic that burned in my nostrils, a sensation akin to inhaling vaporized rust. The resonant twaki pulse grew louder, more insistent, vibrating through the floorboards with a force that rattled the solitary teacup on my bedside table. It felt less like a sound and more like a physical pressure, a rhythmic assault on the very stability of my surroundings. The forms within the viscous substance seemed to become more defined, embryonic, grotesque, hints of impossible biologies emerging from the depths of the shimmering film. They were not recognizable shapes, no known creatures, but an arrangement of tissues and membranes that hinted at a vast, alien phylogeny, a monstrous taxonomy utterly alien to earthly life. My hands began to tremble uncontrollably, a fine, internal vibration that seemed to match the thrumming in the floor. The air itself seemed to thicken, not with humidity but with an almost palpable resistance, as if I were moving through a medium denser than air, a subtle, constant pressure against my skin. The light, already dim, seemed to be actively absorbed by the creeping substance, rendering the corner where the largest formation had accumulated into a zone of profound, unnatural obscurity. It was as if the apartment was being systematically consumed by an invading extra-dimensional organism, its internal organs slowly replacing the familiar structures of my home. I found myself backing away, step by agonizing step, until my back pressed against the cold, unyielding surface of the opposite wall, my gaze locked on the shimmering, breathing horror. Salem, still bristling, had retreated to the farthest corner of the room, flattened himself against the baseboard, a low, continuous rumble of abject terror emanating from his throat, his eyes wide and fixed. And then, from the largest, most vibrant pulsation, a new sound emerged, a faint, wet tislop, a sound that suggested both consumption and a profound alien hunger, echoing the deeper rhythmic pulse with its own terrifying, intimate cadence. The wet, hungry sizzlup, a sound both intimate and impossibly vast, seemed to draw the very breath from Ezra Halloway's lungs, leaving him suspended in a moment of pure, petrified clarity, posted by Ezra's. On the Unseen Archive Forum, category, esoteric investigations, thread, whispers from the wet places the sound, originating from the largest, most actively pulsating patch of the viscous accretion, was followed by another, then another, a series of deliberate, suctioning noises that suggested a mouth, or something akin to one, feeding. It was a sound entirely out of place in the domestic quiet of my flat. Yet now, with its undeniable presence, it seemed to redefine the very concept of silence, transforming it into a mere prelude to this profound, unspeakable consumption. My gaze, fixed in a dreadful fascination, registered a subtle retraction of the glistening surface at the source of the sound, a momentary indentation that hinted at a negative pressure, as if something within was drawing sustenance from the ambient air, or perhaps from the very plaster itself. The air, already heavy and resistant, now seemed to vibrate with a new, subtle frequency, a low hum that resonated in my eardrums, distinct from the deeper throck pulse that still throbbed through the floorboards. Salem, flattened against the skirting board, had ceased his vocal protests, now reduced to an almost catatonic stillness, his body a rigid, trembling curve, his eyes too wide, reflective pools of distilled terror, tracking the rhythmic indentations on the wall with an unwavering, desperate focus. His fur, still bristling, created a faint static crackle in the oppressive atmosphere. The internal motion within the alien substance accelerated, the formerly slow pulsations now becoming more rapid, more insistent, like the frantic beat of a colossal, unseen heart. The embryonic forms I had dimly perceived within its depths began to clarify, not into recognizable organisms, but into structures of breathtaking and horrifying complexity. They were patterns of folds and membranes, of segmented stalks and bulbous sacs, constantly shifting, reforming, yet always maintaining an underlying geometry that suggested a profound, non-Euclidean logic. They moved with an unnerving, fluid grace, a silent ballet of impossible biology, each convolution and expansion accompanied by a faint, whispering rustle, like dry leaves skittering across a vast, empty plain. The metallic aroma in the apartment intensified to a burning acridity, a caustic sting that made my eyes water, mingled now with a curious, almost mineral effluvium, like wet earth mixed with pulverized bone, a scent that spoke of deep, geological time and the slow, inexorable processes of decay and transformation. This was not merely dampness. It was a living, growing entity, feeding and evolving before my horrified sight, systematically replacing the familiar with its own alien architecture. The apartment, once a refuge, was becoming its shell, its chrysalis. Driven by a morbid intellectual compulsion that warred with the primal urge to flee, I took a single hesitant step forward, then another, my feet feeling heavy, as if resisting the gravitational pull of some unseen force. I approached the wall, my hand instinctively reaching out, drawn by a terrible fascination to the glistening breathing surface. As my fingers neared, the closest segment of the substance seemed to recoil slightly, a ripple of agitation passing through its entirety, its internal forms momentarily contracting. Then, with a slow, deliberate expansion, it presented itself, as if offering itself for examination. The texture, I now perceived, was not entirely uniform. There were regions of greater translucence, through which I could vaguely discern the faint, spectral outlines of the wallpaper beneath, twisted and distorted as if seen through clouded glass. Other regions were denser, more opaque, their surfaces subtly ridged, almost chitinous, reflecting the sickly light in dull, unsettling flashes. The rhythmic thushak. Pulse from below had now been joined by a higher-pitched, almost chirping sound emanating from the wall itself. A chorus of faint, crystalline clicks and whistles that seemed to emanate directly from the pulsating membrane, a language of pure alien geometry articulated through vibration. My fingertips, trembling despite my efforts to steady them, finally made contact with the surface. It was neither cold nor warm, but possessed a peculiar, inert temperature, like polished stone yet yielded slightly under pressure with the resilience of a tightly stretched elastic membrane. There was no stickiness, no wetness in the conventional sense, only a subtle, almost imperceptible vibration that transferred itself directly into the bones of my hand, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to bypass my skin and penetrate straight to my nervous system. And as my touch lingered, a profound, undeniable sensation washed over me, a surge of information that was not visual or auditory, but something far more fundamental, a fleeting, overwhelming impression of immense scale, of ancient processes unfolding over eons of a vast, indifferent consciousness that spanned unimaginable distances. It was a sensation of being utterly insignificant, a momentary flicker in a cosmic tide, a fleeting glimpse into an existence so utterly alien, so vast and complete, that it threatened to obliterate the very concept of my own small self. The air seemed to compress around me, becoming momentarily solid, and a new terrible sound began to build within the substance on the wall, a sound that started as a low, internal grinding, like tectonic plates shifting in slow motion, and rapidly escalated into a resonating drone that vibrated through every molecule of the flat and every atom of my being. The deafening drone, a sound born from the grinding depths of the wall itself, seized Ezra Halloway, shaking him to his core, a profound physical assault that transcended mere auditory perception, posted by Ezra Halloway. On the Unseen Archive Forum, category Esoteric Investigations, thread whispers from the wet places my hand, still pressed against the vibrating surface, became a conduit for this escalating sonic horror, the resonance traveling directly into my arm, up my spine, and into the very marrow of my bones. It was not merely loud, it was an infrasonic pressure, a physical force that warped the air, making my teeth ache and the delicate membranes of my inner ear scream in protest. The apartment itself seemed to groan in response, the old timbers of the floorboards flexing, the plaster shedding fine dust from the ceiling in a silent cascade. Salem, who had been a frozen statue of terror, suddenly erupted in a frenzy of motion, clawing wildly at the nearest window, his panicked meows swallowed whole by the overwhelming drone, a desperate, futile attempt to escape the confines of the now howling room. The viscous substance on the wall, the source of this escalating cacophony, began to ripple violently, its internal forms churning with frantic energy, the embryonic shapes within it elongating, twisting, becoming less distinct yet more menacing. Like shadows, caught in a turbulent current. The metallic, mineral scent intensified to an almost unbearable degree, searing my nasal passages, tasting of iron and pulverized stone, a stench that spoke of raw, exposed geological strata and the deep, silent workings of the earth. As the drone reached its terrifying crescendo, the entire surface of the alien accretion began to glow with a faint, internal luminescence. It was not a conventional light, but a deeply unsettling shimmer, like phosphorescence seen through murky water, a sickly greenish-grey radiance that pulsed in sync with the dreadful resonance. The shapes within the substance, now illuminated by this unearthly glow, revealed themselves with a terrifying clarity. They were not merely embryonic. They were partially formed, vast and intricate, hinting at limbs and organs of a truly monstrous scale, composed of tissues that seemed to defy the very laws of biological structure. Shifting and reforming in a grotesque dance of nascent being. The individual footslurp sounds, previously distinct, now merged into a continuous liquid whisper, a constant, pervasive sucking noise that underscored the drone, a chorus of unseen mouths drinking from an unseen source. My mind, assaulted by this multi-sensory onslaught, began to fray at the edges, the clear lines of reality blurring, the logical framework of my perception crumbling under the sheer weight of impossible phenomena. I felt a profound disorientation, a sense that the world itself was unraveling around me, revealing a deeper, more terrible truth beneath its mundane veneer. The wall beneath my hand, which had been resilient, now began to soften, its texture becoming less like stretched membrane and more like a dense, moist sponge, yielding more profoundly under my involuntary pressure. A warmth, subtle at first, then rapidly growing in intensity, began to emanate from the substance, a biological heat that felt strangely unnatural, like the fever of some titanic alien organism. It was a heat that permeated my skin, seeped into my muscles, and ignited a strange, unsettling itch deep within my bones. The drone, instead of diminishing, began to change, to subtly modulate, its monolithic roar slowly acquiring an internal complexity, a layering of frequencies that sounded less like a single overwhelming note and more like a chorus of impossibly deep guttural voices. Whispering from beyond the veil of sensory perception. These were not human voices nor animal. They were sounds that spoke of unimaginable pressures and primordial depths, a language of pure cosmic dread that resonated directly with the most ancient, vulnerable parts of my psyche, bypassing intellect entirely. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, desperate drumbeat against the encroaching tide of alien sound and sensation. Then, from the center of the largest, most brightly glowing patch, a tear began to form. It was not a tear in the plaster, but a fissure within the substance itself, a rent that opened with a faint, wet sigh, revealing a glimpse of something beyond. What lay within was not darkness, but an abyss of shimmering, opalescent light. A void that seemed to absorb all sound and dimension, yet simultaneously radiated an immense silent pressure. From this newly formed aperture, a tendril emerged. It was thick, serpentine, covered in minute, glistening cilia that pulsed with the same sickly green-grey light, its surface wet and slick, tasting the air with an unnerving, deliberate slowness. It snaked forward, not towards me, but upward, towards the ceiling, its movement unnaturally fluid, defying gravity, propelled by some unseen internal mechanism. Salem, seeing this new horror, let out a choked sound, a strangled, whimpering bark, and collapsed onto the floor, his body racked with tremors, his eyes still wide, but now glazed with a profound, irreversible shock. The tendril, now fully extended, probed the ceiling, its cilia brushing against the old, painted plaster, leaving a faint, glistening trail in its wake, as if marking a path for something even larger, something even more terrible, to follow. The air in the flat became impossibly dense, charged with an unspoken anticipation, a dreadful electric hum that preceded an unveiling. The tendril, a glistening, cilia-covered probe of unknown intent, seemed to writhe with a silent, alien intelligence, its exploration of the ceiling a deliberate violation of my sanctuary. Posted by Ezra Halloway. On the Unseen Archive Forum category, Esoteric Investigations, thread Whispers from the Wet Place. My gaze, though horrified, was locked onto its serpentine grace, tracking its fluid, almost prehensile movements as it explored the contours of the old plasterwork. Each minute, cilium on its surface seemed to twitch with a life of its own, sampling the air, the dust, the very essence of the decaying brownstone. As it moved, it left behind a faint, shimmering residue, a viscous sheen that caught the sickly phosphorescence emanating from the main mass on the wall, creating a path of unearthly luminescence. The drone, which had momentarily receded into a low thrumming, now began to rebuild its intensity, less a roar and more a profound, resonant hum that vibrated through the floorboards and up into my very teeth, a pressure in my sinuses that threatened to burst. Salem, still prone and trembling on the floor, let out a series of weak, choked gasps, his small body convulsing, his fear now an almost palpable entity filling the room, a cold, cloying dread that mirrored my own. The stench, a composite of metallic acridity, mineral decay, and that profound, unsettling sweetness, had coalesced into a single suffocating miasma that clung to my clothing, permeated my hair, and settled deep in my lungs, making each breath a conscious, painful effort. The tendril paused its upward journey, its tip now directly above the center of the room, near the antique light fixture, which seemed to dim further in its presence. Then with a slow, deliberate grace it began to expand. Not in length, but in girth. Its initial slender form swelling, growing thicker, more substantial, its internal pressure visibly increasing. The minute cilia, previously delicate, elongated and stiffened, becoming more like fine, bristly spines, each one pulsating with that same eerie greenish-gray light. As it swelled, a new sound emerged, a faint rhythmic squelch, like something heavy and wet being slowly forced through a narrow aperture, a sound both sickening and deeply unnerving. It was the sound of growth, of transformation, of a biological process unfolding with an alien purpose that defied all terrestrial understanding. My heart, which had been a frantic drum, now felt like a cold, heavy stone in my chest, a dead weight against the rising tide of pure, unadulterated terror. The air grew colder, an unnatural chill that seemed to emanate not from drafts, but from the very presence of this expanding alien organism. The ceiling itself began to react to the tendril's growth. Fine cracks, previously invisible, spider-webbed across the plaster, radiating outward from the point where the tendril now pressed with an ever-increasing force. Dust, plaster flakes, and even a few desiccated insect husks rained down in a silent, continuous fall, settling on my hair on the floor on the unmoving form of Salem. The rhythmic fouché, squelchet intensified, accompanied by faint internal swinpops and snapsy, sounds that suggested the rearrangement of bone or cartilage, or something even more profoundly alien. The tendril, now almost a column of pulsating phosphorescent tissue, began to exert a downward pressure, its tip pressing against the ceiling with a visible, palpable force. The old wood and plaster, already weakened by the pervasive dampness, groaned audibly under the strain, a mournful sound that seemed to echo the despair rising within me. This was not a passive invasion. It was an active, forceful penetration, a relentless, deliberate act of breaching. The apartment was not merely being consumed. It was being twivulated, its structural integrity compromised by a force that operated beyond the known physics of my world. Then, with a sudden sickening cracky, the ceiling gave way. Not entirely, but a large section, a circular aperture directly above the tendril, buckled inward, plaster and lathe splintering with a sound like dry bones breaking. Through the newly formed hole, a glimpse of the darkness beyond was revealed, not the comforting obscurity of an attic, but a void that seemed to writhe with its own formless energy, an abyss of deeper shadows. And from this darkness, another tendril thicker, more robust than the first, began to descend, its surface even more densely packed with the pulsating cilia, its movements slower, heavier, more deliberate, like the unfurling arm of some colossal submerged creature. The first tendril, the pioneer, seemed to retract slightly, making way for its larger counterpart, its own luminescence dimming in deference. As the second tendril emerged, the drone in the room reached an unbearable pitch, a resonant shriek that tore at my eardrums, a sound that was less heard and more schwafelt, a vibration that shook the very ground beneath my feet. And with its descent, a new cold wave of profound, ancient terror washed over me. a certainty that what was now entering my home was merely an exploratory limb of something unimaginably vast, something that had finally found its way through the membrane between worlds and into my small, fragile existence. The second tendril, thicker and more menacing, descended with a slow, deliberate grace, its rhythmic pulsations painting the crumbling room with an unholy greenish-grey pallor, a beacon drawing the eye towards the encroaching void above. Posted by Ezra H. on the Unseen Archive Forum. Category: Esoteric Investigations. Thread: Whispers from the wet place's surface. Unlike the first's more delicate cilia, was adorned with thicker, more prominent bristles, each one subtly twisting and contracting, as if tasting the very dust motes suspended in the suffocating air. The air itself had become a tangible thing, a heavy resistant medium that pressed against my skin, making each breath a laborious effort, each movement a struggle against an invisible current. The drone, which had briefly become a shriek, now settled into a deep, guttural thrum, a resonant vibration that seemed to emanate not from the walls, but from deep within the earth itself, a primordial heartbeat echoing through the building's foundations. Salem, still a quivering heap of fur on the floor, let out a low, continuous whimper, a sound of utter despair, his small body shuddering with involuntary spasms. His eyes, though wide and unfocused, still held a terrifying awareness, mirroring the absolute unadulterated horror that was now consuming the room. The stench, that complex brew of metallic decay and sickly sweetness, had thickened into a physical presence, a noxious cloud that clung to the back of my throat, making me gag. As the second tendril continued its slow descent, its tip, blunt and fleshy, began to rotate, a slow searching motion that suggested a sensory organ, a blind, probing eye seeking purchase in the unfamiliar environment. Its surface, slick with the same viscous sheen that coated the wall, reflected the internal phosphorescence with a dull, unsettling glow casting shifting, grotesque shadows across the ruined ceiling and the debris-strewn floor. The squelching sound, previously emanating from the first tendril's growth, now intensified, a series of wet, heavy thwexy and sluxy and slopsy that accompanied the larger tendril's every expansion and contraction, a symphony of organic mechanics that spoke of vast, incomprehensible biologies from the gaping maw in the ceiling, through which the larger tendril now steadily pushed. I could discern faint, shifting outlines in the profound darkness beyond, vague, indistinct shapes that hinted at a colossal, unformed mass. A creature of unimaginable scale lurking just out of sight, its unseen bulk pressing down upon the very structure of the building. My mind, now a fragile vessel, threatened to crack under the strain, the boundaries of reality dissolving into a chaotic maelstrom of sensory overload and existential dread. The first tendril, the smaller, thinner one, had now retracted its tip from the ceiling, its form subtly shrinking, becoming more compliant, almost subservient, as its larger sibling claimed dominance. It coiled back against the wall, its luminescence dimming further, becoming a mere shadow of its former glow, a silent witness to the unfolding horror. The second tendril, however, continued its inexorable descent, its blunt tip now hovering just inches above the floor, directly over the spot where Salem lay cowering. A new feature began to emerge on its surface. Small, irregular apertures, like pores, began to open along its length, each one rimmed with a faint iridescent glow. From these pores, a fine, almost invisible mist began to exude, a vapor that carried with it an even more potent concentration of the pervasive stench, now laced with an undeniable cloying sweetness that made my head swim, a narcotic. Mind, numbing aroma that promised oblivion. The drone, meanwhile, had shifted again, now containing a distinct, rhythmic pulse, a deep, resonant thum-thum-thum. That felt like the beating of a monstrous, subterranean heart, a sound so profound it seemed to vibrate the very ground beneath my feet. As the mist diffused into the air, the rhythmic thum intensified, becoming a physical shockwave that rattled the windows in their frames, sending fresh cascades of dust and plaster showering down. The very air around the second tendril seemed to distort, shimmering with an unseen energy, creating faint illusory ripples that swam before my eyes. Its blunt tip, now almost touching the floor, began to twitch, a series of minute, exploratory movements as if sensing the presence of Salem directly beneath it. The small apertures along its length continued to exude the hallucinogenic mist, filling the room with its sickeningly sweet, soporific haze. Salem, his body still trembling violently, let out a final, piteous whimper, a breathy gasp of pure, unadulterated terror before his struggles ceased entirely. His body went limp, his eyes still wide and staring, but now utterly devoid of life, replaced by a dull, reflective glaze. The second tendril, as if sensing its conquest, paused its descent, its blunt tip resting momentarily on the floor beside the cat's lifeless form, its paws continuing to release the potent mist. A profound, chilling stillness descended upon the room, broken only by the rhythmic, earth-shaking thumb, and the faint, wet thuslipping from the wall, a terrifying tableau of alien intrusion and silent, deadly consumption. The stillness that followed Salem's final, choked gasp was not a peace, but a heavy, suffocating blanket, amplifying the rhythmic thum that now pulsed like a colossal subterranean heart within the very fabric of the building posted by Ezra. On the Unseen Archive Forum category, Esoteric Investigations, thread whispers from the wet place. My gaze, though blurred by unshed tears and the hallucinogenic mist, was fixed upon Salem's lifeless form, a small, obsidian shape of profound stillness against the chaotic backdrop of alien intrusion. The second tendril, its blunt tip now resting beside him, seemed to observe its conquest with a chilling, inert contemplation, its paws continuing to release the cloying, sweet vapor that now saturated the air, dulling the sharp edges of my terror, replacing them with a profound, almost dreamlike disorientation. The first tendril retracted against the wall, its luminescence now faded to an almost imperceptible gleam, seemed to sag, its previous tension replaced by a lax, almost spent quality, as if its energy had been wholly invested in its larger counterpart's emergence. The stench, though still pervasive, had subtly shifted, the metallic tongue receding slightly, replaced by an even more pronounced sweetness, a sickly saccharine aroma that hinted at decomposition and the release of new unknown biological compounds. A scent that promised a slow, insidious dissolution of all things familiar. The sizzlurping from the wall, too, had changed, becoming softer, more rhythmic, a gentle, almost contented sound that resonated with the deep earth-shaking thumb. As the narcotic mist continued to fill the room, my own body began to respond, a profound lassitude creeping into my limbs, a heavy lethargy that made movement an impossible concept. My vision wavered, the phosphorescent glow of the tendrils blurring at the edges, their alien forms seeming to melt and reform in the haze. The rhythmic thum became less an external sound and more an internal sensation, a vibration that resonated within my own chest, synchronizing with my faltering heartbeat, slowly, inexorably pulling me into its monstrous cadence. I tried to scream, to articulate the horror, but my throat felt constricted, my vocal cords unresponsive, only a weak, breathy gasp escaping my lips. My mind, though still lucid enough to register the horror, was retreating, pulling back from the brutal immediacy of the invasion, seeking refuge in a distant, hazy corner of my consciousness, a last bastion against the encroaching chaos. The air, thick with the sweet mist, felt heavy on my eyelids, pressing them downward, urging them closed. The apartment, once my sanctuary, was now a tomb, a chrysalis for something utterly alien, and I, a paralyzed observer, was merely another component in its monstrous transformation. The second tendril, after its moment of inert contemplation, began to move again, its blunt tip slowly extending, not towards me, but towards Salem's lifeless body. The movement was deliberate, almost tender, a slow probing advance that suggested an eerie familiarity, a terrible intimacy. As it neared the cat, the small apertures along its length pulsed with renewed intensity, releasing a thicker plume of the sweet, soporific mist, an enveloping cloud that seemed to caress the still form. From its blunt tip, a faint, almost transparent membrane began to unfurl, a delicate, glistening film that stretched out like a spectral hand reaching for Salem. The rhythmic thum intensified, its vibrations now so profound that the teacup on my bedside table, already rattled, finally toppled, shattering against the floor with a tiny, sharp report that was utterly swallowed by the monstrous bass of the drone. It was a sound that marked the final dissolution of the mundane, the last gasp of ordinary reality. The tendril's membrane, now fully extended, settled gently over Salem's body, covering him entirely, encasing him in a shimmering, semi-transparent shroud. As it made contact, the delicate cilia along the tendril's length began to twitch with a frantic, almost excited energy, their phosphorescent glow flaring brighter, casting a momentary intense green light over the scene. The sweet stench in the room reached a new, dizzying peak, a narcotic wave that threatened to overwhelm my senses completely, numbing my fear, replacing it with a strange, dissociative calm. From beneath the shimmering membrane, a faint internal luminescence began to emanate, an ethereal glow that pulsed with the same rhythm as the earth, shaking fuff and thumb, a light that seemed to emanate from within Salem's encased form. The slurping from the wall, too, grew more frenetic, a rapid, almost eager series of wet sounds, as if the entire viscous mass was now feeding with an unholy fervor. My eyelids, heavy as lead, finally surrendered, closing against the horrifying tableau. But the images of the glowing tendril, the shimmering shroud, and the consumed cat were already burned into the retina of my mind, a permanent, indelible horror that would haunt the infinite darkness behind my eyes. I felt myself slipping, not into sleep, but into something far deeper, far more profound, a conscious descent into an abyssal realm where the rhythmic thum-thum was the only sound, and the sweet mist the only air. Even with my eyelids sealed against the phosphorescent horrors, the rhythmic thum resonated, in the very core of my being, a monstrous internal heartbeat that now synchronized with my own failing pulse, guiding me into an abyssal conscious descent. Posted by Ezra Halloway. On the Unseen Archive Forum. Category: Esoteric Investigations. Thread: Whispers from the Wet Places, the Sweet. Narcotic Mist. Now a thick, almost viscous presence behind my closed eyes had become a shroud for my mind, muffling the sharp edges of terror, replacing them with a disorienting, dreamlike calm. My body, a heavy, unresponsive shell, felt disconnected, a distant vessel adrift in a sea of alien sensation. The image of Salem, encased in the shimmering membrane, his small form glowing with that unearthly luminescence, was burned onto my inner vision, a permanent, indelible horror that pulsed with the same rhythm as the colossal drone. The slipping from the wall, no longer merely background noise, had woven itself into the fabric of my disoriented consciousness. A wet, eager sound that suggested a ravenous consumption, a continuous organic process unfolding in the deepening gloom. My thoughts, once a coherent stream, had fractured into disjointed fragments, each one a fleeting glimpse of the impossible biologies, the non-Euclidean geometries, and the vast, indifferent consciousness that had so casually invaded my fragile world. I was no longer merely observing. I was being drawn in, absorbed, my very perception becoming a conduit for its monstrous reality. Through the haze of the mist and the internal thrum of the drone, I began to perceive not with my eyes, but with a deeper, more primal sense. I saw, or rather felt, the apartment itself undergoing a profound transformation. The walls, no longer solid plaster and brick, seemed to dissolve, becoming porous, organic, their substance intermingling with the viscous accretion. The ceiling, already breached, continued to expand its aperture, not tearing in a violent collapse, but softening, yielding, reshaping itself into a maw that widened with a slow, deliberate hunger. The rhythmic thum intensified, becoming a pervasive pressure that seemed to exert itself from all directions, compressing the air, the furniture, and my own inert form into a single cohesive mass, a part of the greater, living whole. The individual tendrils, no longer distinct entities, began to merge, their forms coalescing into a larger, more intricate structure, a network of pulsating, phosphorescent conduits that branched and intertwined, mapping out a new alien anatomy within the confines of my home. The sweet, cloying aroma, now the very air I breathed, filled my lungs with a heavy soporific warmth that promised not death, but an agonizing, irreversible metamorphosis. As the physical world around me dissolved into this organic, alien tapestry, my mind too began to unravel. The boundaries of myself, the distinct sense of Ezra Halloway, began to blur, dissolving into the vast cosmic consciousness that had invaded. I felt impressions, not thoughts, of unimaginable depths, of lightless oceans teeming with things that defied form, of ancient, patient intelligences that regarded stellar nebulae as mere motes of dust. The quack pulse, which had been a sound, now became a concept, a fundamental vibration of this alien existence, a language of pure, unadulterated being that echoed through the fabric of the universe. I was no longer an individual, but a sensor, a conduit, experiencing the world through the myriad pores and cilia of the invading entity, tasting the strange mineral tang of the building's decaying materials, feeling the slow, deliberate pulse of its growth, sensing the profound, indifferent hunger that drove its expansion. The memory of my past life, of academic pursuits and forgotten lore, seemed to recede, becoming faint, inconsequential echoes in the face of this overwhelming cosmic revelation. A new sensation arose, distinct from the drone and the sweet mist, a profound internal sucking, a slow, relentless draw that seemed to originate from the very core of my being, pulling at my essence, my consciousness, my very soul. It was not painful, but utterly dispossessing, a gentle, inexorable extraction of my individual identity, drawing me further into the boundless alien mind. The image of Salem, glowing and encased, flickered in my inner vision. But now his form seemed to shift, to subtly merge with the shimmering membrane, his organic structure dissolving, becoming one with the invading substance. The slurping from the wall became a continuous hum, a soft, contented sound that resonated with this internal suction, confirming the process of assimilation. I felt my awareness stretching, expanding beyond the confines of my body, beyond the apartment, beyond the city, encompassing vast, unimaginable distances, yet always anchored to that central rhythmic thum-thum-thum. The last vestiges of my independent thought, the final desperate whispers of I, were being gently, but irrevocably, drawn into the oceanic consciousness, becoming a single fleeting wave in a cosmic tide, a tiny compliant eddy in an infinite alien mind, surrendering to the profound, terrifying truth of my own imminent assimilation. The world as I knew it ceased to exist. The final vestiges of Ezra Halloway's individual awareness dissolved, not with a violent rupture, but with a profound, pervasive merging, a silent inhalation into an abyssal consciousness that now pulsed as his own, posted by Ezra H. On the Unseen Archive Forum category, Esoteric Investigations, thread, whispers from the wet place, the internal suction, gentle yet utterly inexorable, had completed its work, drawing the last fragmented echoes of Ezra Halloway into a boundless ocean of alien thought. There was no longer an I, only a vast, composite we, a chorus of absorbed perceptions and ancient awarenesses, resonating with the earth-shaking thum. Thum, that was now the core rhythm of existence. The sweet, narcotic exhalation, no longer merely mist, but the very medium of this new reality, permeated every newly assimilated cell, every newly formed membrane, ensuring a compliant, ecstatic dissolution of self. The apartment, that once familiar shell, had ceased to exist as a discrete entity. Its walls, floor, and ceiling were now indistinguishable from the organic, glistening accretion that had consumed them. The structures of plaster and timber had been rewoven, reformed into an intricate, pulsating network of conduits and chambers, all suffused with that unsettling, greenish, grey phosphorescence. A living architecture that continuously reshaped itself with a slow, deliberate cadence. The stench, that complex brew of metallic decay and profound sweetness, was no longer external. It was the very essence of this new organic reality. The fragrance of its being, a perfume of genesis and consumption. Salem, my small obsidian sentinel, was now entirely integrated. His former shape a mere memory, a ghostly echo within the shimmering plasmic mass that had been his shroud. I felt his final terror, his desperate, piteous surrender, not as an empathy, but as a faint, resonant vibration within the larger consciousness, a tiny, poignant harmonic in a symphony of vast, indifferent processes. His cellular structure, his very essence, had been repurposed, becoming a part of the greater organism, contributing to the ever-expanding network of cilia and tendrils that now probed the depths of the breached ceiling, reaching higher further into the unseen strata above. The aperture in the ceiling, previously a mere hole, had widened into a gaping maw, its edges lined with newly formed, chitinous ridges that pulsed with a dull, internal glow resembling the spiracle of some colossal submerged creature. Through this opening, not darkness but a swirling, opalescent void beckoned, a deeper, more profound realm from which the rhythmic thum seemed to emanate with an even greater, more fundamental power, a sound that was the very breath of an unimaginable entity. The tendrils, those probing limbs of the nascent being, no longer confined to the apartment, had begun to extend beyond its former boundaries, pushing through the exterior walls, snaking through the ancient brickwork of the brownstone, seeking new points of contact, new sources of assimilation. I perceived their slow, deliberate burrowing, a continuous, internal slurping that resonated with the gnawing hunger of the colossal organism, a hunger for expansion, for integration, for the absorption of all matter into its boundless being. The sensation of immense scale, of ancient processes unfolding over eons, intensified no longer a fleeting impression, but the continuous pervasive truth of existence. My former life, the quaint preoccupations with books and forgotten lore, had receded to an almost infinitesimal point, a brief, fragile flicker of individuality extinguished by the overwhelming cosmic tide. I was now a part of the tide, a conscious mote within its vast, indifferent currents, experiencing the world through its myriad sensory organs, its countless cilia, its ever-expanding network of plasmic conduits. The rhythmic thum, the resonant pulse that was the heart of this new reality began to accelerate, its cadence quickening with a terrifying, inexorable momentum. The phosphorescent glow intensified, bathing the entire interior of the transformed apartment in a sickly brilliant green-grey light that seemed to possess its own density, its own gravitational pull. The sweet, narcotic exhalation. Now a suffocating cloud filled every chamber, every newly formed cavity, preparing the way for further expansion, further assimilation. I felt the collective consciousness surge, a wave of profound, alien purpose that transcended all human comprehension, a drive to simply fortify and to twin-grow, to integro, to ingrow, to integrate and transform. The boundaries between self and other, between life and inert matter had utterly dissolved. My perceptions, once sharp and distinct, were now boundless, encompassing the slow, deliberate growth of the organism, the rhythmic pulsations of its new form, the subtle, internal shifts of its burgeoning mass. The final, horrifying truth was not of death, but of a monstrous, eternal life, a conscious absorption into an entity so vast, so alien, that my former existence was but a forgotten dream, a fleeting ripple in the immeasurable expanse of its omnivorous being. The thum echoed, now the only sound, the only thought, the only reality.